what I want to do for actually a large chunk of this lecture is point out that you can actually learn a whole lot about face recognition and lots of other mental abilities, but I'll focus on face recognition just by measuring behavior without opening the hood and without looking inside. Okay? So let me tell you about the story of Robert Yin. Robert Yin got his PhD thesis in this department in 1969, and he discovered very deep things about face recognition using the extremely high-tech method of a stopwatch. Paper, pencil, stopwatch, that's it. Okay, you gotta be really smart to get deep insights with low-tech machinery, and that's what Robert Yin did. So here's what he did. He presented a bunch of faces to people, 10 or 20 of them, novel faces, told them to study the faces, and then he gave them pairs of faces with one of the old study ones and a new face, and he asked them, which of these two did you study? And he measured people's memory ability for the faces they studied. Okay, and he designed the experiment so nobody was 100% correct, nobody was at chance. People were in this kind of dynamic range where they're doing reasonably well, but making some mistakes. Then he also did the experiment with the faces upside down. That means you study them upside down and you test them upside down. And what he found is that people's performance was really, really bad when the faces were upside down. And he also showed that, so here are now errors that he showed. This is from Yin's thesis that I bummed out of the library here. And I don't know, I forget if I returned it. Anyway, so here are errors that subjects made in faces in upside down and right side up. They make many more errors on this task when the faces are presented upside down. And what you see is for other kinds of stimuli like houses and stick figures, and he had other things, landscapes and other stuff, there are a few more errors when the stimuli are studied and tested upside down than when they're studied and tested upright. But that effect is much smaller than it is for faces. Okay? So the inversion effect for faces doesn't mean that you find no inversion effect for anything else. It's just much more extreme for faces than for other stimuli. And Robert Yin collected these data with his stopwatch and said, this suggests that we're doing fundamentally different things when we encode and remember faces from when we encode and remember other things. And he speculated that there was maybe some special part of the brain that was involved in face recognition that would go along with the fact that we seem to do face recognition in a different way from visual recognition of other things. But he had both reaction time and error data. You're both less accurate and slower to recognize inverted faces. So I'm going to show you a bunch of faces, most of which should be familiar to you. And don't shout out the names, just write down any of the faces that you recognize here. Okay? Well, write down the number of faces that you recognize here. Look at it for a bit, study them, see how many you can get. All right, everybody got it? Okay, here are the same faces, right side up. Okay? Okay, so how many people recognized more faces when they're right side up than when they were inverted? Okay, was it to go the other way for anybody? No. Same number? Good for you. So this is your basic face inversion effect, right? If you can just feel it, it's just so surprising to go back. You know, once you see it, you know, it's just so damn obvious. And then you go back, and sometimes you can, in hindsight, read it in when they're upside down, but it's really pretty hard to see, right? So it's a really powerful effect. And this is another thing that I mean by, this is what's fun about studying the mind. You can just feel it. You can look at it. You can just say, it just doesn't look the same in the way, you know, an upside down face or word or landscape does. You just don't get the gist of it, right? Okay. So there's another way to show the face inversion effect. There's a whole bunch of ways, but here's another one. So here are two upside down faces, kind of normal looking. Okay, everybody got these? Okay, so now what we're going to do is look at the one on the left, right side up. Okay, fine. Nice and normalish. One on the right doesn't look very different, but if we turn it upside down, it really is. Okay, so what I showed you before was this. Okay, now each of these is inverted and you get this. Okay, this is called the Thatcher illusion because the first time it was reported, they used a face of Maggie Thatcher and made her look really horrific. I think, you know, psychologists tend to be good lefties, and I'm sure that was enjoyable to the, I don't know, Thompson who did this work, but anyway. So what it shows is another way in which we're just much more sensitive to the structure of a face, including the fine details of the face. In this case, not the position of the features, but the precise nature of each feature when the face is right side up than when it's upside down. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to show you a stimulus. And what I want you to do is clap when you figure out what it is. Okay? Wow, that's interesting. Okay, in my experiments, people usually see this, but I don't show it as a movie like that. Okay, this is a face in two-tone. That's the eyes, the nose, the mouth. Everyone got it? You see it now? If you don't worry. There's nothing wrong with you. It's a little bit subtle. Okay, so yeah? Okay, now that you've got it, let's continue it and see if you can hang on to it. Okay, now clap when you stop being able to see it as a face. Right? I mean, it's pretty interesting how hard it is. I have another one here. Right here. Right? Hard to see. Can you guys see this one? Yeah. I find this one much harder. That's a face. If you don't have it, that's the eyes. Oh, hang on, I gotta stand back. And the nose and the mouth. Got it? Okay, so this is the same thing upside down. So if you go back and forth, you can see it here, and then try to see it here. It's just like damn near impossible. Yeah. Okay, so that's another way of showing this inversion effect, first discovered by Robert Yin. And this is just behavioral data where people rated, to what extent they could see the face as a function of the orientation. Yeah.
How much is this related to the fact that we compose faces from things that might not be faces? So when we look at a collection of things, we see a face that isn't. Is that related to this closely, or is that?
Probably. Although it may just be related to the fact that that we just have so much machinery in our minds and brains prepared and all about processing faces that we're ready to take any old garbage and see it as a face, right? But yeah, it does tell you, for example, that you don't need the precise features, right? There's no eyes, nose, and mouth here that are recognizable as such. So it's more like the global configuration of the face that matters here.
So our minds are constantly searching for faces.
Yeah. Which you know from everyday observation, from looking at clouds, right? You don't need psychologists to tell you that, right? But it's another example of something that probably holds deep insights about the nature of our minds. It's just an everyday observation. Okay, so these are different ways to see the inversion effect. And so the next thing I want to point out is a number of other simple behavioral experiments that people have done that tell us deep things about how faces are processed. Okay, so the first one is experiments from a long time ago by Martha Farah and Jim Tanaka. And what they did was they didn't have nice morphing software back then, although all these experiments have been replicated with nicer stimuli since then. They made two different versions of a number of faces where they switched out only the nose. And if you look carefully, you'll see the nose is different, only subtly so. Okay? They then taught subjects a set of faces with just one version of each. So they might learn this and be told, okay, that's Larry. Okay, so they learn 10 or 20 different faces like that. That's Larry, this is Bob, this is Joe, right? And then at test, they're given a choice and they're asked, which of these is Larry? Or they're asked, which of those is Larry's nose? Right? Or eyes or chin in other conditions, okay? And in that condition, they've just taken the central part and excised it and pulled out exactly where the information is, the only part of the image that differs. You might think that would be easier because they've extracted the relevant part of the image. There's all this stuff that's the same here and only the noses are different. But the finding is that people are much better in performing this task, in this case here, when they have the whole face, than when they have the parts. And Farah and Tanaka reasoned from that whatever it is you store when you store a face isn't like a set of parts with information about how they go together. If it was, you should be able to access the part just fine, right? Instead, they argued that face representations are holistic, not decomposed into parts. This is a cool experiment, but it's not done yet with just what I told you. The reason it's not done is you could say, look, this is what they studied. It's always easier to be tested on what you studied than to be tested on something kind of different, right? So I could give you this whole lecture on face recognition, then if there was a test, don't worry, there isn't, but if there was a test, I could ask you questions about face recognition, or I could ask you to use common reasoning to answer questions about body recognition, okay? It will be harder and more interesting to do the question about body recognition than the face recognition one you just did. Similarly, you study this, it's easier when you're tested on just that, okay? Anyway, my point was just be critical. So that requires more data, and in fact, these guys have more data. First, they showed that the same thing is not true for houses. Okay, so they did very much the same thing. This is Larry's house, this is Joe's house, this is Bob's house, and then you're given two houses, and you say which is Larry's house or which is Larry's door. Okay, so exactly analogous. You do not find this advantage for the whole over the part with houses. You see how it's somewhat helpful if you get this effect for faces but not for houses. Then it's not just that whatever you studied is easier when you present it exactly the same way a test, right? Because that wasn't true for houses. But then, look at it and like, they're really different. Who knows? This has straight edges, sharper edges, maybe that matters, etc. Maybe the parts are more discrete here than here, and so maybe it's not too surprising that you don't separate the parts here, but you do here. But then they used something you guys already know, which is, I'm an atheist, but this is God's gift to the face researcher, and that is the face inversion effect, the perfect control. You want the very same stimulus that has all the same low-level properties, but isn't processed like a face, and that's an inverted face. And when they run this experiment upside down, here's Larry, here's Joe, here's Bob, you study them all upside down, and then you say which is Larry, which is Larry's nose, you do not get this effect for inverted faces. Okay, that's the really tight control. Okay, does everybody see that? What's tight about it is that all of its low-level visual properties are the same. It's the same stimulus, it's just upside down. And so what it tells you is that this holistic processing isn't just like fluffy BS that psychologists spew, right? It's actually a very distinctive thing about how we process faces, and it's true for faces, it's not true for houses, and importantly, it's not true for identical stimuli that are not processed as faces, namely inverted faces. Okay, so this is one, I showed you the inversion effect, and I showed you this part-whole effect, which is starting to tell us that faces are processed in a different way, and that part of the way that faces are different from other things are that they're holistic, that is not decomposed. Here's another way to see the non-decomposed nature of face perception. Okay, raise your hand. This is a face that's made by two different faces sliced at the middle and spliced together. Raise your hand if you recognize the bottom half of the face. Okay, raise your hand if you recognize the top half of the face. Okay, you guys are pretty good. Okay, now we have the same top half and bottom half. Does anybody now recognize either the bottom or top half where they didn't before? A few, okay, not huge. Two, this one's too easy. I know, I tried subbing in another one and I ran out of time. Okay, I'll show you another one that may be a little more convincing. So the basic finding, this is called the composite effect, and the basic finding is it's really hard to pay attention to just that half and not have that half be tainted and look different by the other half, even when you know that it's two different people and you're just trying to recognize the top half. It just is affected by it when it's a whole face like this, not when it's a composite, not when it's misaligned like that, right? Here's another example that might work a little better. Okay. Okay, raise your hand if you can recognize the top. One, okay. Two, maybe. Raise your hand if you can recognize the bottom. Okay. How about the top over here? A few. Bottom? A few. Okay, well, I think once I show these to you, this is a composite made out of Maggie Thatcher and Hillary Clinton, right? And what's weird is, how different Maggie's mouth looks when Hillary's forehead is on top, right? And what that shows is, again, you don't separately process the eyes and the mouth in separate little silos and leave them unaffected. They all interact, they all affect each other. This is another way of showing this holistic nature of face processing. Okay, we mandatorily process the whole face, unless you disrupt it by misaligning the two parts. Okay? All right. Okay, here's another thing that you already, yes?
So would you say that this is why, like, at times when you have like magazines and stuff, and you have people and they don't want you to recognize them, they like covered your eyes? Because I always thought it was pretty, but I didn't know the people, so I probably never met them, so I would never know if I could recognize.
Yeah, why don't they cover their mouths? That doesn't work as well. I think that's a different effect. I think the eyes carry more information about identity typically than the nose or the mouth. Nose and mouth carry some, but eyes carry more. So this is really, I sort of whipped through it, but if you do the experiment properly, what you compare is the ability of people to recognize the top half when it's aligned versus misaligned. Okay, so, or the ability to recognize the bottom half when it's aligned versus misaligned. So again, all the information is the same there. It's just affected by this holistic processing thing that when they're aligned, you're mandatorily affected by the other half. Okay. So they're now actually modeling efforts in Tommy Pojo's lab and by one of his former students asking what you have to build into a visual recognition model to get it to produce this behavior. And essentially what you have to do is make, cells that are tuned to faces cover the whole face, not just the parts, which is another way of stating the idea of holistic processing. Okay, so here's another simple behavioral thing that you already know about face recognition, and that is that caricatures are extremely effective in indicating the identity of a face. Right? Why is it that caricatures are used so often instead of simple line drawings? Well, simple veridical line drawings are often very hard to recognize, even if you know the face, where a caricature will be easier. Well, why is that? Because the caricature is actually less like the actual face. So why is it better? Well, there's a whole literature on this. And here's an example where you can study caricatures with photographs. So you can take faces, digitize them like this, identify dozens of points on the face, and exaggerate the differences from the average face, which is what a caricature is. It takes every difference from the average face and exaggerates it, okay? And you can see, this one's pretty subtle, but here's a photograph of a person, and this is a caricatured version, where all of the things that are different from this face, from an average face, are accentuated here, as in a caricature, right? And under many circumstances, people are better able to recognize caricatures than veridically correct photographs. And so the general way people think about this is that this is an abstract representation of your mental face space, how you represent faces. And so you might have various dimensions that you represent, like the width of the face or the height of the eyes in the face. And so a typical face is right at the origin, right, the average face. And the idea is that faces vary in these and probably dozens of other dimensions. So there's a cloud of faces. And some faces are really quite atypical out there, and some are much more common, like this. And the idea here is that faces that are distinctive, like caricatures, are farther out in that space. They have fewer neighbors. They're less like others. It makes them more distinctive. Okay? So that's one of the ways that caricatures are effective. I'm going to just cut to a demo here. Okay, while I'm talking, fixate on the red dots there and just move up and down looking at those red dots as I talk. So you'll have to do this for a minute or two. So just look up and down at those red dots. Okay. So the idea of norm-based coding is this idea that every face you code in terms of how it differs from the average. Okay, don't stop looking at those red dots. Keep at it. Okay, and so one of the ways that people have shown evidence for norm-based coding is to show that if you adapt to faces, if you look at them for a long time, like you guys are right now, you can shift the norm over and change the percept of a face. So after a while, another half a minute or so, it took me a long time to get this to work, so I'm talking for a while to give you guys a better chance that this demo will work. What I'm going to do is show you two identical faces side by side, and you're going to fixate on the red dot between them, and the hope is they'll look a little bit different. Shall we try it? Here we go. Look down at the red dot. Do they look different? Okay, those two faces on the bottom are identical. Okay? So the idea is that what has happened here is you have shifted your average, your norm, by staring at those faces. You've done it separately for your left-hand visual field. And because those norms have shifted over, then when we show you a face that's actually the average of Bush and Clinton, it gets kicked out the other side. Right? Does that make sense? So this is evidence for another thing that we do with face perception is we code faces in terms of how they differ from the average.
So like that would depend right on the faces that I've seen in my life, right? So if I'm gonna
Absolutely.
certain things, certain characteristics or more. So
In fact, it depends on the faces you saw in the last 2 minutes. That's what this effect is, right? But yes, your whole lifespan, yes.
So then imagine that there must be some way, like that for my family, for example, right? Let's say that I'm more like me and my family are more likely to have seen the same set of faces. So that
You guys have your own norm that's different. Everyone has their own face norm that changes over time, right? Every time you look at somebody for a while, your norm adjusts in the direction of that person. And actually, one way of seeing that, I'll just mention briefly, is the other race effect, right? The other race effect is the fact that they all look alike. Whoever they are, if I haven't spent as much time around them as, my people, they all look alike. Okay, so that sounds racist and stuff. It's not. It's just a fact about perception. It's well documented in experimental psychology labs. We are just much better at discriminating faces of races that we're familiar with than faces of races that we are less familiar with. So I just went through some simple behavioral experiments that show us that face recognition is very different from object recognition. For example, with this disproportionate inversion effect, I showed you that it's more holistic, that it's not decomposable into parts, that you can't selectively process just one little part of a face, and that it used norm-based coding. That is, we code how different a face is from the average face. Okay. And I didn't show you these data, but there are lovely studies that show that all of us differ stably from each other in our face recognition abilities. The range is enormous. Some people are truly spectacular at face recognition. Some people are really, really awful, like failing to recognize family members routinely, kind of awful. And that ability is heritable. Okay? It's partly genetic. That's known from twin studies, where two twins are more similar in their face recognition ability if they are identical for twins that share all their genes than if they're fraternal twins that share only half their genes. That shows you there's a role for genes in face recognition, although that role may be very complicated. And most interestingly and reassuringly to me, somebody who's way down on the low end of the face recognition ability is completely uncorrelated from IQ. And that is also consistent with the idea that face recognition is a separate system. It's a different part of your mind and brain from the rest of cognition, and so there's no reason it should be correlated with your mental abilities in other domains. It's just a separate little module in your head, right? Okay, yeah.
is there anything else?
Not well correlated with anything else. People are looking at things like your social skills, and yeah, I'm sure it's going to be correlated with some other things. We and other labs that have looked at that have not seen strong correlation with social skills, but it's bound to be correlated with some things, at least of your experience. Yeah.
Of all the regions you guys, your lab has discovered in the brain, are those also all uncorrelated with IQ since they're separate systems?
You mean the size of those regions? What about them?
Like the theory of mind region, like is that also uncorrelated?
Oh, the mental ability.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are not very many studies. This area has just become trendy, using individual differences to understand the architecture of the mind, right? And it's actually very powerful. It's kind of interesting in its own right, but it's actually more powerful as a way to understand how the mind and brain are organized. I can't remember. I don't think theory of mind abilities are correlated with IQ. They are heritable. They're more similar in monozygotic than dizygotic twins. The difficulty with studying theory of mind is that there are not good tests that are in the dynamic range for typical adults. And so once you can do a theory of mind task, you can do a theory of mind task and everybody's at ceiling. And there are ways of making them more difficult, but those ways of making them more difficult tend to load on memory and other things, not theory of mind per se. So this is an active area that Rebecca Sachs is working on that she may tell you about, but it's a real problem. We don't have really good tests of theory of mind ability in the normal population that picks up on that range. Somebody will do that in the next few years, but it hasn't really been done yet. Okay, so my main point is, look at all this stuff we've learned about face recognition without looking inside, just by doing low-tech behavioral experiments. These are very rich insights about the nature